money or love? Which one truly defines happiness? When Isabella signed a contract to marry the wealthy yet paralyzed CEO Adrian Blackwood, she never imagined the chaos that would follow. At first, it was just a deal, a cold transaction. She would become his wife, endure the public scrutiny, and in return, she would receive a life-changing billion-dollar gift, more than enough to rescue her struggling family from financial ruin. But what she didn't expect was the hidden layers beneath Adrian's cold exterior. There were secrets locked behind the walls of his grand mansion, business rivals who wanted him out of the picture, family members who viewed her as an opportunist, and a medical condition that seemed irreversible. But Isabella wasn't one to back down. Somewhere between the contract clauses and the long, silent dinners, she found herself tangled in a web of deceit, betrayal, and emotions she wasn't ready to face. And when she discovered something that could change Adrian's fate forever, the battle between money and love became even more complicated. Would she walk away with her billion-dollar reward? Or would she risk everything, including her heart, to fight for the man she never meant to fall for? Stay till the end, because this story is packed with unexpected twists, secrets, and a love story that defies all odds. If you had to choose between a billion-dollar reward or an uncertain love, which would you pick? Tell me in the comments while we dive into the story. The hospital lobby smelled of antiseptic and despair, a cold, sterile place where hope came to fray at the edges. Isabella Monroe sat on a hard plastic chair, her fingers clutching a crumpled bill, the ink smudged from her anxious grip. Her mother's condition was worsening, lungs failing, machines beeping, doctors murmuring about surgery, but the words from the receptionist rang louder than any monitor. No payment, no procedure. She'd begged, pleaded, her voice hoarse from days of fighting a system that didn't care. The receptionist wouldn't even meet her eyes anymore, just shuffled papers and repeated the same line. "We can't help you without funds." Isabella's phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her spiraling thoughts. An unknown number glowed on the screen. She hesitated, her thumb hovering, then answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? You need money. I need a wife. Let's talk." The voice was deep, commanding, laced with a cold authority that made her spine stiffen. No greeting, no softness, just a blunt proposition that hit her like a slap. "Who is this?" she asked, her heart thudding. 30 minutes, downtown. Blackwood Tower, top floor. Don't be late." The line went dead. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. It could be a scam, a prank, but desperation was a ruthless driver. Her mother's life hung by a thread, and this voice, whoever it was, dangled a lifeline. She grabbed her bag, the bill still clenched in her fist, and bolted for the bus. 30 minutes later, she stepped into the gleaming lobby of Blackwood Tower, a fortress of glass and steel that loomed over the city. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless, the mirrored walls reflecting her worn jacket, her tired eyes, her messy auburn hair. When the doors opened, she found herself in a sprawling office. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that stretched to the horizon. And there, behind a massive desk, sat Adrian Blackwood. He was a legend, a billionaire CEO who'd clawed his way up from nothing, building an empire of tech and real estate. A car accident 2 years ago had left him paralyzed from the waist down, but even in a sleek, custom wheelchair, he radiated power. His dark hair was swept back, his jaw sharp, his gray eyes piercing as they locked onto her. He didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake, just studied her like she was a puzzle he'd already solved. "Sit," he said, his voice matching the one from the call. She did, her knees trembling as she sank into the leather chair. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers steepled. "I won't waste time. This is a contract marriage, a business deal. You marry me, stay by my side for a year, and you walk away with $1 billion. Isabella blinked, the words crashing over her like a wave. $1 billion. It sounded absurd, like a cruel game. "You're serious?" she managed, her voice shaky. "Deadly," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Sign the contract, play the part, and your problems vanish. Refuse, and you're back to begging in that lobby." She swallowed hard, her fists clenching in her lap. "Why me?" "Because you're desperate," he said simply, his tone flat. "And because I need someone the press won't question. You're nobody, that's the point." There was no warmth in him, no hint of kindness, just cold, ruthless logic. She should have been offended, but the truth stung too much to argue. She was nobody, a barista with a dying mother and a mountain of debt. He was offering a way out, a golden ticket wrapped in steel. He slid a contract across the desk, the paper crisp, the terms stark. 1 year, no intimacy, no love, just a public facade. A wife for the cameras, a prop to quiet the rumors swirling around his accident and his empire. At the end, $1 billion wired to her account. Her mother's surgery, her life was secured. "The choice is yours," Adrian said, leaning back. "But I don't offer second chances." Her hands shook as she reached for the pen. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, but she signed. Her name a jagged scrawl on the dotted line. 1 year. $1 billion? A marriage to a man who didn't even glance at her as she sealed her fate. The wedding was a whirlwind, a spectacle orchestrated for the world to see. The Blackwood estate sprawled across acres of manicured lawns, its marble halls packed with reporters and flashing cameras. Isabella stood in a designer gown, ivory silk, tailored to her frame, feeling like a doll dressed up for someone else's play. Adrian sat beside her, impeccable in a black suit, his wheelchair gleaming under the chandelier light. The vows were mechanical, his "I do" flat and emotionless. There was no kiss, no tender moment, just a handshake behind closed doors after the officiant stepped away. "Your room's down the hall," he said that night, his voice clipped as he wheeled toward his own wing. "This isn't real, don't forget that." She nodded, her throat tight, and retreated to the guest suite. Plush but cold, a stranger's space in a stranger's world. She'd expected his distance, braced herself for it. What she hadn't expected was the hostility waiting in the shadows. At the reception, amid the clinking glasses and forced laughter, a woman approached her. Tall, elegant, with sharp green eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," she said, her voice low, venomous, as she sipped champagne. Isabella stiffened, clutching her own glass. "And you are?" "Celeste Blackwood," the woman replied, her lips curling. "Adrian's stepmother. I keep this family running while he plays his games." Isabella forced a polite nod, her pulse quickening. "Nice to meet you." Celeste laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "Oh, it won't be. Enjoy playing house, darling. Step out of line and I'll make sure you regret it." The threat hung there, chilling, as Celeste glided away into the crowd. Isabella plastered a smile for the cameras, her stomach twisting into knots. She'd signed up for a year, not a war, but it was starting to feel like both. That night she lay in the unfamiliar bed, the estate silent around her, and stared at the ceiling. The gown hung in the closet, the contract locked in a drawer, but one thought kept her awake. What have I done? She'd saved her mother, yes. Surgery was scheduled, payment cleared. But at what cost? Adrian's coldness, Celeste's warning, the weight of a life she didn't recognize. It pressed down on her, relentless. And then a sound, a faint creak from the hall. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Footsteps? No, impossible. Adrian couldn't walk, but there it was again, closer now, a shadow flickering under her door. She held her breath, waiting, but nothing came. Just silence, thick and heavy, leaving her with a question she couldn't answer. What's hiding in this house? Little did she know, the worst was yet to come. And it wasn't just Celeste she'd have to face. The morning after the wedding, the Blackwood estate felt like a mausoleum. Grand, cold, and eerily still. Isabella woke in the guest suite, the massive bed empty beside her, the sheets untouched except where she'd tossed and turned. Sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting faint patterns on the floor, but there was no warmth in it. No husband waiting, no breakfast laid out. Just a silence that pressed against her chest, a reminder of her role here. She wasn't a wife in any real sense. She was a contract, a means to an end for Adrian Blackwood. The thought stung, sharp and bitter, as she pulled on a sweater and jeans, her bare feet padding across the cool marble floor. She found him in his home office, a fortress of dark wood and glass tucked at the end of the hall. He was already dressed, crisp black suit, tie knotted perfectly, his wheelchair positioned behind a sleek desk piled with documents. His hands moved with precision, flipping pages, his gray eyes locked on the work, not even flickering as she stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee, a half-empty mug sitting cold beside him. "Good morning," she said, her voice testing the quiet, hoping for something, anything to break the ice. He didn't look up. "If you're expecting a honeymoon, you're in the wrong marriage," he muttered, his tone dry, clipped, carrying a faint edge of disdain. She crossed her arms, irritation sparking. "I'm not. I just want to know what's expected of me." His lips twitched into a smirk, cold and fleeting, as he finally met her gaze. "You're expected to smile for the cameras, show up at public events, and, most importantly, stay out of my way." "And if I don't?" she countered, her chin lifting, refusing to let him dismiss her so easily. His expression hardened, his voice dropping to a low, steady warning. "Then you won't like the consequences." The words landed like a stone, heavy and chilling, sending a shiver racing down her spine. She held his stare, though, those piercing eyes, sharp as steel, daring her to push back. She'd signed the contract, tethered herself to this man for a year, but she wouldn't be a silent pawn. If he thought she'd shrink under his glare, he'd underestimated her fire. Staying out of his way, though, proved harder than she'd imagined. The next day, she stepped into Blackwood Enterprises, a towering skyscraper of glass and steel that gleamed against the city skyline. Adrian had insisted she join him for a press conference, a staged moment to solidify the narrative for the board and the public. The lobby buzzed with activity, suits hurrying past, phones ringing, but the moment she walked in, the air shifted. Whispers trailed her like shadows, sharp and unrelenting. "She's just a gold digger," a woman in a tailored blazer hissed to a colleague, her voice carrying over the hum. "Married him for the money," another muttered, adjusting his cufflinks as he strode by. "She won't last a month," a third scoffed, his tone dripping with contempt. Isabella kept her head high, her heels clicking against the polished floor, but the words burrowed under her skin. The office was a labyrinth of glass walls and forced smiles. Executives offering curt nods, assistants dodging her gaze, a veneer of politeness that barely hid their judgment. She was an outsider here, a prop in a world that didn't want her. Then Damien appeared, Adrian's right-hand man, cutting through the crowd with a coffee in hand, and a grin that danced between charm and mischief. He was tall, wiry, with hazel eyes that sparkled with something unreadable. "Welcome to the Lion's Den," he said, handing her the cup, his voice low and playful. "They're all waiting for you to trip." She took the coffee, her fingers brushing his briefly, and forced a smile. "Let them wait." He laughed, a quick, genuine sound that cut through the tension. "You've got spine. Good, you'll need it." The press event unfolded in a blur. Cameras flashing, Adrian's voice steady as he spoke of new chapters and partnerships, his hand resting on hers for a split second, just long enough for the photos. She smiled as directed, her jaw tight from the effort, but her mind wandered. Something was off. Beyond the polished words, she caught flickers of strain. Board members exchanging quick, pointed glances, conversations halting when she passed. A restlessness simmering beneath the surface. Later, lingering outside a glass-walled conference room, she waited for Adrian to wrap up a meeting. The voices inside were muffled, but one sliced through, low and deliberate. "Adrian's a liability. If he doesn't step down soon, we'll make sure he does." Her breath caught, her body pressing against the wall as her pulse hammered. A threat, clear and cold. She risked a glance through the glass, but the speaker's back was to her, his frame broad, his suit dark. She found Adrian in his office afterward, the city sprawling behind him through the massive windows. He was hunched over a tablet, his face unreadable, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his sharp features. "I heard something," she said, her voice urgent. "Someone in there said you're a liability. They're planning to force you out." He didn't flinch, didn't even look up. "I know," he said simply, his tone flat, almost bored. Her stomach knotted, frustration surging. "And you're not going to do anything about it?" His fingers tapped the armrest, a rare tick of movement. "Let them try." She stared at him, baffled by his arrogance, this unshakable wall he threw up, this refusal to bend. But as she stood there, she saw more, the tension in his shoulders, the faint clench of his jaw, the way his eyes flickered with something buried deep. He wasn't as invincible as he pretended. For a man who had everything, wealth, power, control, he carried a heaviness that felt like defeat, a quiet ache etched into his stillness. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop watching him. At the estate, he took late-night calls in his study, his voice low and clipped, his hands balling into fists when he hung up. At the office, he pushed aside meals, trays of sandwiches and fruit left untouched, as if food was an afterthought. She'd catch him staring out those towering windows, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the skyline, his face unguarded for fleeting moments. He was a puzzle, this man, cold and commanding, yet fraying at the edges in ways he wouldn't admit. And she was starting to wonder what had broken him, what loss lingered beneath the paralysis he wore like armor. One evening, restless and unable to sleep, she wandered into his study. He'd left for a late meeting, the room dim, lit only by a desk lamp casting a soft glow. Papers littered the desk, and her eyes snagged on a folder, half open, forgotten. Curiosity tugged at her, her pulse quickening as she stepped closer and flipped it open. Medical report stared back, pages dense with technical terms, but a few phrases leaped out. Possible recovery, experimental treatment, nerve regeneration potential. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling as she read. His condition might not be permanent. There was a chance, a real chance. He could walk again. She stood there, rooted, the paper shaking in her grip. Why hadn't he told her? Why wasn't he fighting for this? The sound of his wheelchair rolling down the hall snapped her back. She shoved the folder closed, stepping away just as he entered, his silhouette framed in the doorway. "You're up late," he said, his voice cool, his eyes narrowing as they flicked to the desk. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he'd hear it. She couldn't hold it in. "I saw the reports, Adrian, about your condition. Why aren't you doing anything about it?" His jaw tightened, his gaze turning to ice. "I don't need false hope," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "I've learned to live like this. Or maybe you're just afraid," she fired back, frustration spilling over. "Afraid of what happens if you get better." "Drop it, Isabella," he snapped, his hands gripping the armrests, knuckles whitening. But she couldn't let it go. She saw it now. The fear flickering behind his defiance, the way he clung to control because it was all he had left. This wasn't just about the contract anymore, not for her. She'd signed up for a year of playing a role, $1 billion to save her mother, but standing there, staring into his guarded eyes, she felt something shift. She wanted to understand him, to peel back the layers of this man who pushed everyone away. And that realization hit her hard, because it wasn't part of the plan. It was dangerous, messy, real. The next morning, she walked into Blackwood Enterprises determined to keep her distance, to stick to the script and nothing more. But as she passed the conference room, she caught another fragment of conversation. Damien's voice, low and tense. "The shipment's delayed. If he finds out, heads will roll." She froze, her mind racing. What shipment? Something for the company or something else? Before she could piece it together, a shadow loomed beside her. She turned to find Celeste Blackwood, Adrian's stepmother, standing there, her green eyes glinting with a sharp, knowing edge. "Curious little thing, aren't you?" Celeste said, her smile tight, her voice smooth as glass. "A word of advice, stop digging. You won't like what's buried here." Isabella's throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "I'm just doing my job." Celeste stepped closer, her perfume sharp and overpowering. "Your job is to look pretty and keep your mouth shut. Cross me, and that $1 billion will be the least of your worries." The threat sank in, cold and heavy, as Celeste turned and glided away, her heels clicking like a countdown. Isabella stood there, her hands trembling, questions stacking up like bricks. What was Adrian hiding? What was Celeste guarding so fiercely? And why did it feel like every step she took pulled her deeper into something she couldn't escape? That night, alone in her room, the estate was too quiet, the walls thick with unspoken truths. She lay awake staring at the ceiling when a faint sound broke the stillness. A low hum, like machinery coming from somewhere below. She sat up, her heart thudding, straining to listen. It wasn't the usual creak of an old house. It was deliberate, mechanical, close. She slipped out of bed barefoot and crept to the door, cracking it open. The hallway was dark, empty, but the hum persisted, vibrating through the floor. She followed it, her pulse racing, down the corridor and toward the west wing. Adrian's private quarters, a place she'd been told never to enter. The hum grew louder, a steady pulse, until she reached a locked door, its frame sealed tight. She pressed her ear against it, and the sound sharpened, a rhythmic whir like equipment running. What was he keeping in there? Before she could decide whether to knock or retreat, a shadow moved at the end of the hall, tall, silent, watching her. She spun, her breath catching, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Her hands shook as she backed away, the hum fading behind her, leaving her with a chilling question. What's he hiding down there? So, here's a question for you all watching. Do you think Adrian's too proud to accept help, or is he guarding something deeper? The weight of the medical report sat heavy on Isabella's chest, a truth she couldn't shake. Adrian could walk again. It wasn't a faint hope or a long shot. The pages she'd found in his study spelled it out in black and white. Experimental treatment. Nerve regeneration. High success probability. Yet he'd done nothing. No calls to specialists, no plans for therapy, just silence. She'd lain awake all night after hearing that strange hum from the west wing, her mind churning with questions. Why was he hiding this? Why wasn't he fighting? The next morning, she found him in his home office, the estate quiet around them, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. He sat behind his desk reviewing contracts, his wheelchair a silent barrier between them. She didn't knock, just stepped inside, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "We need to talk about those reports." His hands stilled on the papers, but his gray eyes didn't lift. "I don't need your pity," he said, his tone flat, cutting. Her frustration flared, hot and sharp. "Then what do you need, Adrian? To waste your life in that chair out of pride? To let people tear you down when you could fight back?" His fingers tightened on the armrests, knuckles whitening, his jaw clenching hard. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low, controlled, but laced with something raw. "Then make me understand," she snapped, stepping closer, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. His breathing was steady, deliberate, but his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, betrayed him, flickering with a vulnerability he wouldn't name. For a moment she thought he'd answer, that he'd let her in. But then he turned his head, his gaze dropping to the desk. "Drop it, Isabella." She didn't move, her chest rising and falling fast. At first she'd pegged it as arrogance, his refusal to chase a cure, his cold dismissal. But the more she watched him, the clearer it became. The way his jaw tightened when a maid glanced at him with sympathy, the way he avoided his reflection in the glass doors, the way his fingers hesitated, trembling slightly before brushing his lifeless legs. It wasn't pride holding him back, it was fear. Fear of hoping, of trying, of failing again. And maybe, deep down, fear of who he'd become if he wasn't the broken man he'd built his walls around. She wanted to push, to crack that armor, but the world around them was closing in too fast. At Blackwood Enterprises, the air crackled with unrest. She'd gone with Adrian to the office that afternoon, a sleek tower of glass and steel where every glance felt like a blade. The board was growing restless. She could feel it in the clipped greetings, the way executives huddled in corners, their voices dropping when she passed. Someone was leaking stories to the press, headlines questioning Adrian's leadership, whispers of a forced resignation gaining traction. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every meeting. And at the heart of it stood Celeste Blackwood, Adrian's stepmother, her presence a storm cloud over the estate. She'd never hidden her contempt for Isabella, but now her attacks were sharper, bolder. That evening, as Isabella crossed the grand foyer, Celeste intercepted her, her green eyes glinting like shards of glass. "You've served your purpose, dear," she said, her voice smooth but venomous. "But this charade won't last." Isabella squared her shoulders, her pulse quickening. "You don't scare me." Celeste's smirk deepened, a predator sizing up prey. "Maybe you should be." The words lingered, a chill seeping into Isabella's bones as Celeste swept away, her heels clicking ominously against the marble. What did she mean? What was she planning? The questions gnawed at her, but something else was shifting too. Something between her and Adrian, something she hadn't expected. It happened later that night after a long day at the office. The estate was quiet, the staff gone, the halls dim. She found him in the library, not his study, but a softer space, lined with books and warmed by a crackling fireplace. He sat by the hearth, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the flames. The light danced across his face, softening the hard lines, and for once he didn't look like the untouchable CEO. He looked human. She hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside. "Mind if I join you?" He glanced up, surprise flickering in his eyes, but he nodded. "Suit yourself." She settled into the armchair across from him, the fire's warmth easing the chill she'd carried all day. They sat in silence at first, the crackle of the logs filling the space. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, his voice low, almost tentative. "My mother used to read to me here, before everything changed." She tilted her head, caught off guard by the admission. "What was she like?" A faint smile tugged at his lips, fleeting but real. "Kind, strong. She'd have liked you." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and something softened in her chest. She leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You don't talk about her much." He took a sip of whiskey, his gaze returning to the fire. "No point. She's gone. Accident took her too. Years before mine." The parallel hit her hard. 2 losses, 2 crashes, shaping the man in front of her. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm, a small gesture meant to comfort. He stiffened at first, then relaxed, his eyes meeting hers. There was no coldness now, just a quiet intensity that pulled her in. "I don't know how to do this," he said suddenly, his voice rough, unguarded. "Let people in. Not after everything." "You don't have to do it alone," she replied, her hand lingering, her heart thudding. He set the glass down, his fingers brushing hers, tentative then firm, pulling her closer. She didn't resist. The space between them vanished, and when his lips found hers, it wasn't calculated or cold. It was raw, desperate, a collision of need and longing. Her hand slid to his shoulders, his to her waist, the fire casting their shadows against the wall. It wasn't part of the contract, wasn't planned, but at that moment it felt inevitable. They pulled apart, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. "This doesn't change anything," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "Doesn't it?" she whispered back, her fingers tracing his jaw. He didn't answer, just kissed her again. Slower this time. Deeper. a promise neither of them could voice. The night blurred after that, a tangle of whispered words and shared warmth. The library their refuge from the chaos outside, but that closeness made the next blow cut deeper. Days later, still reeling from their night together, Isabella passed his study, the door ajar. She paused, hearing voices. Adrian's, cold and detached, speaking to Damien. It was always just a deal, nothing more. Her heart stopped, her fingers tightening around the doorknob. She wanted to believe she'd misheard, that the man who'd held her by the fire didn't mean it, but the finality in his tone was a knife, twisting in her chest. She'd been foolish to think she'd started to matter, foolish to let her guard down. Something inside her cracked, a fragile hope shattering. That night, she stood in her room, staring at the suitcase on her bed. She'd pulled it from the closet, her hands moving on autopilot, folding clothes with trembling fingers. She'd come here for her mother, for the money. Not for this. Not for a man who could kiss her one night and dismiss her the next. For the first time since stepping into his world, she wanted to leave, to run from the hurt blooming inside her. But as she zipped the bag, a wave of nausea hit, sudden, sharp, doubling her over. She stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the sink, her reflection pale in the mirror. It passed, but the realization crept in slowly and relentlessly. She'd missed her cycle. Weeks ago, she'd dismissed it as stress, but now... Her hand pressed to her stomach, her breath hitching. Could she be pregnant? The thought was a jolt, a secret she couldn't face yet, not with everything crumbling around her. Before she could process it, a shadow moved outside her door, quick, silent, gone in a blink. Her pulse raced. Someone was watching her, just like that night in the hall. She stepped into the corridor, but it was empty, the hum from the west wing faint and persistent. Then a crash, glass shattering somewhere downstairs. She froze, her blood running cold. Was it Adrian, Celeste, or someone else? She stood there, suitcase packed, heart pounding, torn between fleeing and facing the chaos. What was happening in this house? And what was she carrying inside her? If you were in Isabella's place, would you walk away or fight for Adrian? Isabella stood in the guest suite of the Blackwood estate, her suitcase zipped tight on the bed, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She'd convinced herself she was ready to leave, ready to walk away from Adrian, from the contract, from the chaos that had swallowed her life. The crash she'd heard the night before still echoed in her mind. Glass shattering downstairs, unanswered questions piling up. But she'd told herself it didn't matter. She'd packed her things, folded her resolve into every shirt, and whispered to herself that this was the right choice. Adrian's cold words, "It was always just a deal," had cut too deep, and the fragile hope she'd carried since their night by the fire had shattered. She was done. But just as she turned the knob, a thud echoed from the hall, heavy, sharp, unmistakable. Her breath caught, her hand freezing. She stepped out, her heart pounding, and saw him. Adrian, slumped in his wheelchair near the staircase, his head lolling forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. The strong, guarded man she'd come to know was gone, replaced by someone fragile, vulnerable, barely conscious. Panic surged through her, raw and electric. "Adrian!" She rushed to him, dropping to her knees, her hands trembling as she touched his clammy skin. His breathing was shallow, ragged, his eyes half open but unfocused. "Stay with me, please." Her voice cracked as she fumbled for her phone, dialing for help, her instincts overriding every thought of leaving. "Ambulance, now! Blackwood Estate! Hurry!" The minutes stretched into eternity, sirens wailing in the distance, staff rushing in, paramedics barking orders. She stayed by his side, her hand gripping his, her mind screaming one truth she couldn't deny. She cared. Despite the contract, his coldness, his infuriating walls, despite everything, she cared. And she couldn't leave him like this, not when he looked so broken, not when her heart refused to let go. The hospital was a blur. White walls, beeping machines, doctors murmuring about exhaustion and a sudden drop in vitals. Isabella paced the waiting room, her stomach churning, until a nurse finally let her in. Adrian lay in the bed, hooked to monitors, his face still pale but his breathing steadier. She sank into the chair beside him, her hands twisting in her lap. He'd been pushing himself too hard. Late nights, skipped meals, the weight of the board's threats, and his body had given out. But she couldn't shake the medical reports from his study, the chance he'd ignored. If he wouldn't fight for himself, she'd do it for him. She made a call that night, her voice trembling but firm, to Dr. Elena Carter, a renowned neurologist who'd pioneered treatments for cases like Adrian's. "I've seen his files," Isabella said, pacing the hospital corridor. "There's a chance he could walk again. Please tell me you can help." Dr. Carter's voice was calm, measured. "It's experimental, high risk, no guarantees. But yes, there's potential. I'll need his consent." "He'll get it," Isabella replied, though she wasn't sure how she'd convince him. She had nothing left to lose. Not her mother, now recovering thanks to the money, not her pride, already battered. This was about him now, about the man she'd started to see beneath the armor. When Adrian woke the next day, groggy and disoriented, she was there, her resolve stealing her spine. He blinked at her, confusion clouding his gray eyes. "Why are you still here?" His voice was hoarse, weak, but sharp with suspicion. Her throat tightened, emotion clawing its way up. "Because maybe it was never just a deal for me." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. His gaze held hers, searching, and for the first time she saw a crack in his walls. A flicker of something raw, unguarded. But he didn't speak, just turned his head away, and the moment slipped. The treatment started days later after she'd worn him down with arguments and quiet pleas. Dr. Carter's team worked fast, infusions, therapy, tests, but Adrian remained distant, even as his body responded. One afternoon in the rehab room, she watched him try to move his fingers, slow, shaky, but real. His breath caught, his eyes widening in shock. "It worked," he whispered, almost to himself, and she smiled, her chest aching with a mix of relief and hope. But he didn't soften, not fully. Even as he made progress, standing with support by week's end, he kept her at arm's length, his words clipped, his walls rebuilding. She'd catch glimpses of warmth, a fleeting glance, a murmured, "Thank you." But then he'd pull back, as if afraid to let it grow. It wore on her, the push and pull, until one morning she couldn't take it anymore. She'd been feeling off for days, nausea, fatigue, a faint dizziness she'd blamed on stress. But that morning, alone in her bathroom, she'd taken a test, her hands shaking as two pink lines stared back at her. Pregnant. A trip to the clinic confirmed it. Twins, 6 weeks along, a legacy from her mother's side. Her night with Adrian by the fire had left more than memories. It had tied them together in a way she hadn't foreseen. She pressed a hand to her stomach, fear and wonder colliding. How could she tell him? Would he even care? She found him in the estate's garden that afternoon, sitting in his wheelchair under a sprawling oak, his cane resting beside him. A sign of progress, but not enough to bridge the gap between them. She approached, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "I'm leaving, Adrian. The contract's over. You don't need me anymore." He didn't respond at first, his fingers, now capable of curling into a fist, twitching against his thigh. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something different, something unguarded. "What if I told you?" he started, his voice lower than she'd ever heard, rough with emotion. "That I tore up the contract the moment you risked everything for me?" Her heart stuttered, the words sinking in slow and deep. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let them rewrite the pain of his betrayal, the coldness she'd overheard. But fear held her back. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of what the twins meant for a man who'd barely let her in. "You don't have to pretend anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "You're free. So am I." She turned to leave, her steps heavy, her hand brushing her stomach instinctively. But this time, Adrian didn't let her go. She heard the scrape of his cane, the uneven shuffle of his feet. Shaky, determined. And then his hand caught hers, pulling her back. She spun, startled, to find him standing. Unsteady, leaning on the cane, but standing. His gray eyes locked on hers. "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice raw, stripped bare. "I've been a fool, Isabella. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to need you. But I do. I love you." The confession hit her like a wave, crashing through her defenses. She stared at him, tears welling, her hand still in his. "Adrian?" He stepped closer, his free hand cupping her face, his touch warm, real. "Stay, not for a deal, for me, for us." Her breath hitched, and before she could think, she closed the gap, her lips finding his. Soft at first, then fierce. A kiss that poured out every unspoken word. His arms wrapped around her, steady despite his fragility, and she melted into him, the garden fading around them. When they parted, foreheads pressed together, she whispered, "I'm pregnant, twins." His eyes widened, shock giving way to wonder. "Twins?" He laughed, a quiet, disbelieving sound, and pulled her closer, his voice thick. "We're a family." But the moment didn't last. This moment didn't last. Before Isabella could respond or savor the fragile hope blooming between them, a shadow loomed at the garden's edge. Celeste Blackwood stood there, her green eyes glinting with fury, a phone in hand. "You think this ends here?" she hissed. "I've got proof. The accident wasn't an accident. I made it happen." Isabella's blood ran cold, Adrian's grip tightening on her hand. The crash from nights ago flashed in her mind. Glass downstairs, the hum from the West Wing. Was Celeste behind it all? Before they could react, she turned and vanished into the dusk, leaving them with a chilling truth. The fight wasn't over. Isabella looked at Adrian, her heart racing. She'd saved him, carried his children, but now they faced a new threat, one that could destroy everything. Should she stay and fight, twins and all, or walk away from the danger? Should Isabella give Adrian another chance, or is it too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The hospital parking lot was bathed in the soft glow of dusk, the air cool and crisp as Isabella stepped out, her coat pulled tight against the evening chill. She'd just visited her mother, recovered now, thanks to the surgery she'd funded through months of grueling work at a cafe and late-night shifts tutoring online. It wasn't the $1 billion she'd been promised, but it was hers. Earned, honest, a lifeline she'd clawed out of desperation. Her life wasn't grand, not like the Blackwood estate with its marble halls and endless wealth, but it was steady, real, a foundation she'd built brick by brick. She could breathe again, move forward, almost. Almost because a hollow ache lingered in her chest, a quiet emptiness she couldn't name. She'd walked away from Adrian weeks ago after Celeste's chilling confession in the garden, after the truth about his accident and the twins she carried tied her heart in knots. She'd left the estate, the contract nullified, her suitcase in hand, determined to protect herself and the babies growing inside her from a world of secrets and threats. But even now, standing under the fading sky, a part of her felt incomplete, like a song cut off mid-note, a story unfinished. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her hand brushing her stomach instinctively. 6 months along now, the twins a gentle weight she felt with every step. She'd kept it from him, hadn't called, hadn't reached out. He didn't need to know, not after his cold words, not after the chaos of Celeste's schemes. She'd told herself it was better this way, safer. But as she started toward her car, a figure caught her eye. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving across the lot with a purpose that stopped her cold. Adrian, he wasn't in his wheelchair. No cane, no hesitation. Just him, walking on his own, his steps steady, deliberate. Her breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs as he closed the distance. The man she'd fought for, the man she'd saved with that experimental treatment, stood before her now, whole, unbroken, his gray eyes locked on hers with a determination that stole the air from her lungs. "Isabella," he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the evening quiet. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, her gaze tracing the lines of his face. Sharper now, softened by something new, something unguarded. He stopped a few feet away, then, to her shock, lowered himself to one knee, right there on the asphalt, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't need a contract, he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion. I need you. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, hot and sudden, but she blinked them away, her throat tightening. Adrian, no more money. No more deals, he continued, his hands resting on his knee, steady despite the tremble in his voice. Just us. She let out a shaky breath, searching his face, those piercing eyes, that strong jaw, for any hint of doubt, any trace of the coldness she'd once known. But there was none. Just him, raw, open, a man who'd walked through fire to stand here now. Her hand hovered near her stomach, the twins a secret she hadn't planned to share. But as she looked at him, something shifted. For the first time since they'd met, she let herself believe in him, in them. A slow smile curved her lips, tentative but real. Then stop making it about money. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his face, tracing the warmth of his skin. And start making it about us. His eyes darkened with a rush of emotion, relief, longing, love, and before either of them could say another word, he rose, closing the gap in one fluid motion. His hands cupped her face, gentle but firm, and he kissed her. Not out of obligation, not out of desperation, but out of something deep and true. Her arms slid around his neck, her body pressing against his, the world fading to just them, his warmth, his breath, the steady beat of his heart against hers. It was slow at first, tender, then fierce, a promise sealed in the quiet of the parking lot. When they parted, foreheads pressed together, he smiled, a rare, unguarded thing that lit up his face. I've missed you, he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheek. She laughed softly, tears slipping free now despite her efforts. You're standing, you're really standing. Thanks to you, he said, his voice rough with gratitude. You fought for me when I wouldn't. I was a fool to let you go. Her hand found his, their fingers lacing together. I had to protect myself. After Celeste... She's gone, he cut in, his tone hardening for a moment. I found proof, recordings, documents. She rigged the accident, paid off the driver. She's facing charges now, locked out of the company, the estate, everything. Isabella's breath hitched, the weight of that truth settling in. The crash she'd heard, the hum from the West Wing, it all clicked. The equipment I heard was that... a private lab, he admitted, his gaze steady. I'd been funding the research in secret, but I couldn't face it. Not until you pushed me. Celeste tried to sabotage it, delay shipments, keep me down. She's the one who smashed the glass that night, trying to scare you off. Relief washed over her, mingled with a flicker of awe. He'd been fighting in his own way, even when he'd pushed her away. And the board? Handled, he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Damien sniffed out the leaks. They're loyal now, or out. She nodded, her mind racing, but then his eyes dropped to her hand, still resting on her stomach. His brow furrowed, a question forming. Isabella, are you... She swallowed, her heart pounding. Pregnant, twins. 6 months. His jaw slackened, shock giving way to wonder. Twins? He stepped back, his hand sliding to her waist, then gently to her rounded belly, his touch reverent. Ours? Ours, she whispered, a smile breaking through her nerves. From that night by the fire. He laughed, a full, rich sound she'd never heard from him before, and pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, careful but firm. A family, he said, his voice thick. I don't deserve this, but I'll spend every day earning it. She nestled into him, the twins shifting slightly as if sensing the moment. You already have, she murmured. Just don't shut me out again. Never, he promised, kissing her forehead, then her lips. A soft, lingering press that felt like home. But the peace didn't settle fully, not yet. As they stood there, wrapped in each other, a car screeched into the lot, headlights cutting through the dusk. Isabella tensed, Adrian's grip tightening protectively. The door flung open and Damien stepped out, his face grim. Adrian, we've got a problem. Celeste, she's out on bail, and she's coming for you. Isabella's stomach dropped, fear spiking through her joy. Adrian's jaw clenched, his stance shifting, stronger now, resolute. Let her try, he said, his voice steel. She won't touch us? He turned to Isabella, his hand squeezing hers. We'll face this together. You, me, and them. His gaze dropped to her belly, a fierce determination lighting his eyes. She nodded, her resolve hardening. She'd built a life without him, yes, but now? Twins, love, a future? They'd build one together. Celeste's shadow loomed, a final test, but as Adrian pulled her close, his strength anchoring her, she knew they'd fight. For each other. For their family. Weeks later, they stood in a quiet nursery at the estate, 2 cribs side by side painted soft blue and yellow. Adrian's arm slipped around her waist, his step still careful but growing surer every day. What do we name them? He asked, his voice soft, teasing. She leaned into him, a smile tugging at her lips. Something strong, like their father. He kissed her temple, a chuckle rumbling in his chest. And brave, like their mother. The threat of Celeste lingered, an open question, a battle yet to come. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They had each other, their twins on the way, a love forged through fire. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs, a beginning, not an end. So, here's a final question for you all watching. Would you have taken the $1 billion and left, or would you have stayed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this story's wrapped, but the conversation's just getting started. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more stories like this.